Professor Bates is going to take over and get us into art. And I know the newcomer is very interested in poetry, and I have to apologize, there's very little poetry in this, even though it's in the title. The only poetry we handled very briefly is in describing Plato's dialogues as poetic and Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra as the longest and best poem ever written according to German scholars. So what we're really getting at here, and we mentioned Wittgenstein, is a type of a way of looking at poetry and art through the eyes of a neurologist, through the eyes of contemporary neuroscience. So to understand how a neurologist might conceive of the perception of art, we have to really give you the nuts and bolts of neurology, going back all the way to the beginning of neurology and build up the history. So that's what we did. And to build up the history of neurology, we had to start with philosophy and then psychology. And we'll just whiz through what we did there. But just as a matter of explanation, this is not a course about art and poetry per se, but more so the perception of poetry and art and how the mind works in a contemporary understanding of neuroscience. And then in today's lecture in particular, we're going to even use the word art differently and talk about the art of medicine, how it's experienced from a neuropsychological standpoint. So today's lecture, my half of it, we're going to get into the modern neurologist using the contemporary neuroanatomy that we've learned. I'm going to review that again very briefly, the neuroanatomy. Then how does the neurologist actually practice the art of medicine? Because what is a neurologist? He's a physician. We're going to talk about the physician-patient relationship, which itself is an art, a little different way of using the word art. And because this is going to be a big transition lecture where I'm going to do a half an hour and then Gary's going to do a half an hour, taking us into the emotional experience of art from a psychological standpoint after I've laid the groundwork for how psychology works in terms of the mind. It's a big connecting piece from my lecture to his lecture, and complicated. I think probably best to hold questions till the end, because we could digress very easily and not be able to get into Gary's half of the lecture. So I'm going to watch the clock and keep myself to 30 minutes. So, what did we do last time? As I mentioned before, psychology grew out of philosophy, and neurology grew out of psychology and psychiatry. So we took it back to Socrates and Plato, because this is really the first writing we have where the psyche, the soul, was actually segmented into parts. The three-part soul, which was later coming up very clearly in Freud's id, ego, and superego, which is really an exact mirror of the three-part soul of Plato. So we took it from there into Nietzsche and his instinct, and how Nietzsche was a character expressing himself in opposites, as we see in this pop art representation of Nietzsche, and expressing himself through a dialectic of poetry, the same way that he's the dialectic of the dialogues, to bring us to a place where we cannot exactly speak these great philosophical truths in simple language. We have to do it using an artistic format. And in his poem, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which really summed up all of his philosophies in one long poem about how guilt was formed in the human psyche, using a lot of the same concepts that Freud actually picked up on later. Freud himself, being a neurologist for the first 10 years of his career before he became a psychiatrist and founded psychoanalysis, studying with Charcot, putting together some aspects of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, which he studied in the laboratory with his ideas of psychology, studying with Charcot, who was the embodiment of the first great neurologist who took disease state and neuroanatomy and combined them at a level never done before. Also, not throwing out the psychology that came before him, but making big advances in explaining hysteria, so-called pseudo-seizures or non-epileptic seizures on his floors at the Salpêtrière. and then bringing us up to Wilder. So now we're back to segmenting the brain, very specific parts of the brain having very specific functions, including psychological functions. So we're not going to throw that out. We talked about Phineas Gage and frontal lobe injury and how that changes personality. So some parts of the brain have very basic functions. Here's the homunculus. This is the motor strip. This is where we have on the cortex movements of the hand, movements of the face and tongue. But we also have, besides this motor strip, we've got this huge frontal part of the brain involved in emotion, other parts of the brain involved in emotion. And we can keep segmenting the brain into these different functional areas. The occipital lobe for vision, parietal lobe for putting a lot of things together and spatial orientation, temporal lobes for memory, frontal lobes with emotion. We talked about the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. But these segmentations of the brain are very simplistic. And when we want to talk about something very complicated by putting together memories with vision and putting this together with emotional areas of the brain, when we have an emotive response to art or to a poem or to something that is much more complicated like our day-to-day life, then this just doesn't get us there. What gets us there is functional MRI scanning. So this was the big jump to the future, to the present. This brings us up to 2008. So this is already old for neurology. This is already 6 years old. So we can still use the word history in this talk, even though we're bringing it from very far history up to very recent history to bring us to where we are now. And this is a picture of a person who is experiencing a photograph, a work of art. And this is so distinctive that with all this detail that it can be matched to the particular painting that this person is looking at when grouped with a large group of patients and a large group of people with about 90% accuracy. So why is that and how is that? Well, it's very complicated, but we also share a lot of the same brain functions, connecting all these areas together with functional MRI. And we're going to come back to this in the last lecture and talk about how we all share certain emotions or complex brain activities with objects. All right, so this is a piece of the neuroanatomy, neurophysiology puzzle that I want to give you that I did not give the last time, and I feel like we need to give a little more nuts and bolts about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology before we move on to the main part of the lecture, which is only 15 minutes, about the doctor-patient relationship and how that works. So to get into psychology in the modern sense, we really have to get into neurochemistry. We have to get into how these chemicals influence the way the brain works in terms of nuts and bolts, but also how we have learned to manipulate this as neurologists, as psychiatrists, to actually change the way we think, the way our emotions work, the way we respond to the world. So what am I looking at here? I'm looking at one nerve talking to another nerve. So we talked about the structure of the brain being a complex wiring system. Well, how do we attach all these wires together? We attach them through neurotransmitters. And how does this work? Well, we package neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. The ones we're going to talk about are dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. We package these. They're released within thousands of seconds. They go across this synapse. They're received by another receptor, and then a new electrical impulse is passed on. So we can manipulate this environment by manipulating these particular chemicals, and particular chemicals are involved in particular processes. And the ones we know the most about in the world of psychiatry are the ones I mentioned: serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And we know, I'm going to come back to this, but let's just look at this slide, where how are these areas connected? What are the important areas in, let's say, serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine? Well, here's serotonin pathways here. They're very widely distributed throughout the brain and the brain stem, and we know that this system is aberrant when people have depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety. And by manipulating serotonin pathways, we can fix depression. We can fix obsessive compulsive disorder. Not always, but often. And this will actually change the way we look at things. So when a patient develops depression, instead of the glass being half full, the glass is half empty, and they say, "Doc, I don't know what happened to me. I just don't look at the way that I used to look at the world. I have negative thoughts all the time." Maybe they have depression running in their family. Maybe they've had a head injury. Maybe they've developed multiple sclerosis. Maybe they have some problem in their brain that is making this circuitry aberrant. So what our modern chemicals do, excuse me, wrong direction, is we inhibit with drugs like Prozac the reuptake of this chemical into this synapse, into this nerve. And we increase the amount of these chemicals available to the receptors over here, so we have boosted serotonin in the brain. So when you hear about depression is a chemical imbalance, how do we know that? Well, we can measure these chemicals in spinal fluid and other areas, but the biggest proof that there is a so-called chemical imbalance is that when we change this brain chemistry, this person says, "Doc, I'm not myself." Comes back a month later and says, "Doc, I feel like myself. The world looks the same to me again." Or I'm not having my anxiety, or I'm not having my panic attacks, or I'm not having my obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's how it works in a nutshell, and I think we need to layer that on top of the neuroanatomy that I gave you to understand that we really are dealing not just with the functions of motor functions and sensation, but mood. Because we're going to talk about mood in terms of what art does to our mood, okay? When you take a bite out of a piece of chocolate, there is a rush of dopamine in your brain. When you look at something that makes you feel really good, there's a rush of dopamine in your brain. So if we look at dopamine, it's very involved in pleasure and reward. It's also very involved in addiction. Okay, so when a cocaine addict takes cocaine, he gets a rush of dopamine, and he needs that rush of dopamine. Norepinephrine is more involved with energy and concentration. Serotonin, obsessive compulsions, they all are involved in mood, and the antidepressants have worked on all of these systems. Most notably, most of them work primarily on the serotonin system with selective serotonin reuptake inhibition. All right, so that's the last piece of neurochemistry that I'm going to give you, neuroanatomy and so forth. And we're just going to take this into the real world of how this affects the way we deal with people. This is a background information, so we have to have this sort of all in our minds when we're actually dealing with the patient. And actually, aren't we all somewhat psychologists when we deal with people in general in the world? We're not all neurologists, but we're all somewhat psychologists, and we deal with people in a way that we hope is going to be with our friends and families, enhancing their lives. And it's the same thing with a physician. A physician is there to do what? To make you better. And to do that, there has to be a connection. There has to be an understanding on the psychological level of what's going on with the patient. Are they depressed? Do they have signs of depression? Get into this person's life and find out what makes them tick as part of understanding their disease. So this is the greatest doctor that ever lived, according to most historians. This is Sir William Osler, and the reason he's considered to be such an amazing doctor, even though he was a doctor before we invented penicillin, is because he really invented the way we deal with patients now. And when we teach medical students, how do you be a real doctor? How do you practice the art of medicine? It's all about personality. It's all about being able to connect. And he was the first guy that really emphasized this. He also was the first one that took the medical students up on the floors and taught teaching at the bedside. He took them out of the classroom, said, "This is not the way to learn medicine. We're going to teach medicine at the bedside, and you're going to watch how I interact with patients. And you're going to watch how I learn about patients from my observations of their personalities, not just their disease, but their personalities." So here are some of the great Osler quotes that we sometimes hit the medical students with. It is much more important to know what sort of patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. Another way to say this is study the patient, not the disease. So the disease is secondary. First you have to know your patient, then you can know the disease. He who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patients does not go to sea at all. It's all about the patients first. Then you can be a genius doctor, but if you don't understand people at all, you can't talk to your patient, you can't connect with your patient, you can't understand something about your patient's personality, you're not going to be a physician. So all the medical students have to learn psychiatry. It's a mandatory course. In neurology, we'll learn more psychiatry, but this is part of being a doctor. So here's some more Osleriana. Observe, record, tabulate, communicate. Use your 5 senses. Learn to see, learn to hear, feel, learn to smell, and know by practice alone. That's how you become an expert. So this is the next thing we're going to get into is after you know your patient, you've got to have a very keen sense of observation. Then you can draw on all this fund of knowledge that you've learned in medical school. You add that to the keen observations that you've had about the patient's personality and their physical ailments, and then you filter it down into the differential diagnosis, and you figure out what your patient has. So you do have to be smart, and this is really like a Sherlock Holmes kind of thing. You really have to observe everything and then put it together once you've observed everything and learned everything else. Medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. So then you come down to, well, I've learned all these things. What is the most likely thing my patient has? We are here, and then he's an incredible humanist. So he had statements also not just about patient care, but about life in general. We're here to add what we can to life, not to get what we can from life. So I mean, this is what this is what we tell a student that wants to go into medicine. We tell them, okay, this is great. You're interested in science, but you also want to be a humanist. You have some interest in humanity. And then finally, kind of puts it all together. Listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis. If you don't listen to the patient, you don't have a chance of getting the diagnosis. All right. So, how does this come together? What does this have to do with Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes? Well, I mean, that's ultimately what we would like to be. If you were a great physician, you would maybe be a Sherlock Holmes kind of guy. But it's not enough. The Sherlock Holmes character is smart, he knows a lot of things, but he's disconnected. So what really makes these stories work is actually Dr. Watson being with him, because Watson is the humanist. And together they make a whole physician. You can be really smart, but if you don't have the Dr. Watson there that tells you, Holmes, this is a person here, this is not just a machine, then they really don't work very well. And this character comes up again in pop culture, and you see it on TV now and in lots of different television shows, the basic archetype of the genius who can't connect with people. And that's who Sherlock Holmes was, and that's who the Downey Jr. Character, when he played Sherlock Holmes, I thought he did a great job of that. But the more modern equivalent we have of this is this guy, House. Has anybody not seen House? Okay, so maybe somebody hasn't seen House, but he had a 6-season run. All my medical students have seen House, and they just think, a lot of them kind of went into medicine because they just got fascinated by this guy, because he was a Sherlock Holmes guy. He's a modern Sherlock Holmes character, and he's incredible. He gets all these crazy diagnoses that nobody else can get. But I warn my students and residents, don't get too caught up in being a House. That's not going to work. First of all, so he's a great zebra hunter. So we call the zebras the diseases that nobody can diagnose. They're rare diseases, you just have to be great at it. They gave him his own department of diagnostic medicine with just an amazing amount of manpower, unlimited manpower. So they can take one case, and he's got his team of 4 doctors, and they take one case for an entire week. So this is not the real world at all, but that's how he hunts his zebras. And he's got this dark humor, which it's good for the residents who are with him, but it's not so good if the patients hear his black humor about these patients. A person taking a history, he sends his residents to talk to, really treats the disease rather than the patient. So he's the opposite of the complete doctor. He's the Sherlock Holmes without Watson. But he has a little team of Watsons that work with him, that go and actually talk to patients. And so as a balancing, they do actually make the Sherlock Holmes and Watson team in the modern era. So he's not very good for common stuff. I mean, most of the time when we see patients, you're reassuring them what you have is common, you're going to be okay, we've seen this before. He's got no time for that. He wants to just hunt zebras. And he's got an antisocial personality, so he's not a very good doctor in many ways. So it's kind of an icon. We're going to get into icons later in the last lecture. So Again, just a preview of our next lecture. We're going to get into the functional MRIs. Again, this was the diffusion tensor. We're looking at all the wiring here, looking at all the connections between the areas of the brain that happen when we image the brain sequentially over time, and look at all the incredible amount of activity that goes on, not just these segmentations of the brain that took so long for neuroanatomists to figure out over hundreds of years, that we looked at. This is the visual center, this is the emotional center, this is the memory center. It gets a lot more complicated than that. When the brain is actually working, there's thousands of connections going on all the time. But we can sort of envision this with the segmentation techniques that I told you about, or the paradigms. And then we can imagine these wires being connected by this brain chemistry. We can manipulate that brain chemistry in a lot of different ways, not just with medications, but with meditation, with art, with lots of different, anything that stimulates you, basically. So, again, I'm going to just review, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Bates to take over. So again, this course is not about neurologists that produced art or neurologists that produced poetry, although I think that many scientists in my field have had very artistic approaches, and it's a very creative process to do science. It's really more about understanding how we experience art from the standpoint of a neurologist or of modern neuroscience. So when I met Gary a year and a half ago, something like that, 2 years maybe,
2 years.
We just, it was within minutes we were talking about this. And we've continued to have these conversations about how he's thinking about things coming from his field of being an artist and teaching art, and my field of being a neuroscience scientist and teaching neuroscience, and the areas where we overlap. I think that when you take two fields that seemingly are very far apart, you do have to make some stretches to connect the dots. So please allow us a little bit of liberty, because we are making a few stretches here and there to connect some of these dots between art and poetry. But Gary is going to now take over, and thank you for your attention. And I'm going to get you your thing up here. Let's do your talk. It is right here. There's your talk. This one's yours.
So since Tom and I have never done this before, we're hoping your questions and answers will help us. Just to give you a little past history, I got into art through medicine. I started out at Wesleyan in the pre-med program, was in my second year, and I had zoology, and my teacher looked over my shoulder one day and said, "Your drawings are beautiful. Have you ever had an art course?" And I grew up in Nebraska, in a little town of 2,000. We did not have art in Nebraska, Ashland, Nebraska. So therefore, I said no, but I enjoyed art, and I had always done art through my childhood on up. My mother encouraged me to take art lessons now and then. But a year and a half later, I switched from medicine to art, much to my father's dismay. It caused a big hoo-ha in the family. But he kept saying to me, "You're going to starve to death as an artist." So he's now 89. So when I saw him last, I said, "Do I look like I've been starving all these years?" So we have a joke about that. But consequently, that link between art and science, I think, is so strong, and I don't think we've ever really explored, either profession, how we really use these two knowledge bases comfortably, and we haven't really been able to articulate that. And in my teaching for 42 years, K through 12, and then on the college level, and then I ran a nonprofit art league for 4 years and worked with a lot of adults, I've noticed these links that seem to keep reoccurring and reappearing. And so I wanted to know more scientifically from Tom how those links really occur. And through different artists, I've learned a great deal. For instance, I think I'm going to give you a bibliography at some point, but 3 books that are very influential, I think, for people in the arts and people who want to understand, interpret, and analyze art. The Nicolaides book, The Natural Way to Draw, is an incredibly creative approach to how to learn to draw. Particularly with adults, I found generally they're intuitively already established. They may have art collections in their home, they may have proclivities, things they like or dislike. They sit down to draw and they say, I can't draw. That's their attitude. When really basically you're teaching them how to see, how to look, how to observe, like Tom was saying most doctors are taught to do. And many times we have to free ourselves in different ways. For instance, the first anatomy course I had a lot of trouble drawing faces. And I think it came back from my childhood symbolic set, which we all have as little kids. We learn to draw with symbols, and oftentimes you plug in the symbol for a face or a stick figure rather than really looking. We go on automatic pilot. We pull up from our psyche what that was because we're comfortable with it, and we put in, what kind of a symbol we have. So I had one brilliant professor at the University of Colorado who said to me, don't draw faces. Draw the figures, don't draw the faces, don't draw the hands, don't draw the feet, just get down the form, get down whatever it is you feel you can get down comfortably, and then we'll see where we go. And within about 2 months, the faces started to emerge, and literally some of them actually look like the people that I was drawing, which was amazing to me. So by freeing myself up and saying, you don't have to make the person look like the person, then I could add my interpretation, develop that comfortability with it, and go on and draw. So these exercises are brilliant that Nicolaides invented. He died in 1938. This is like a Bible in every college that you can, anybody that knows anything about art will mention Kaiman Nicolaides, who taught at the New School in New York. And a lot of it is relating to left brain, right brain. Also, when artists create, there are 2 definite modes that they create within. And they mix and match them, and they can even use them both simultaneously. But if you think of an architect thinks empirically. They very dramatically draw their design. They can hand their design that's so well done to, say, Joe over there, and Joe, another architect, can execute that design and recreate that building and move it forward. So we call that kind of generally in a general format an empirical way of creating. The intuitive process is a mode that a lot of us work in, and it has the more emotional feeling. So if you were an impressionist, say, and you wanted to paint a landscape and you caught up in the mood and the season and the color, etc., you might be working plein air outside, and you begin working very carefully, and before you know it, you've got probably 3 paintings underneath the one painting you started with. And you kind of roll with your punches on that, and it evolves and becomes an intuitive painting. When the painting's done is when you decide it's done. A lot of people have trouble knowing when to stop, and I think in time, you learn as an artist, as you evolve, probably as a doctor, when to start and when to stop. So that leads me to the other part that I wanted to mention. How do we know the Mona Lisa is a good painting? How do we know, certain accepted artists have a standing, and that there's a written language and then there's an unwritten language, and it's all influenced by subjectivity, emotionalism, psychology, etc. So if you said the Mona Lisa was a great painting, you'd say, well, the background is very unusual in the Mona Lisa, and it's the first time a portrait was combined with a landscape in that format, which makes it unusual and interesting, and the way it's painted, the style, the use of the color. So artists use these elements when they create. Along with that, they look at space and observe differently. So, for instance, let me see if I have an example here I could just pull up. You know, this was a student drawing, which I'll explain in a couple minutes. If you react to this piece as an overall piece, what is the first thing your mind reads?
Halloween.
Halloween, the skull.
Blue.
And would you say it's well balanced or not balanced or as a composition? I know we have some artists in the group. Generally, if you turn artwork all different directions, even if there's an strong emotional connotation to this, the thing, if you squint your eyes, the thing that shows up most, if you're squinting your eyes, usually means that it's not totally balanced. If my positions in the late 90s was an art director on Long Island, and I was able to convince the administration to do medical illustration, and I linked with New York Institute of Technology, and we had medical illustration for college credit on the high school level. And it was an incredible experience teaching it. For instance, I went into all the science classes and started teaching drawing techniques. First I taught the science teachers how to draw, and then how to observe, how to draw from specimens, and then we started working with kids. And one of the most exciting things I found, and then I'll show you some of the really great drawings, was the special ed kids found out that we were doing all of these drawings in biology and AP biology and all this stuff. And of course their skills were very limited. And I didn't know what I was going to do with them. And the special ed science teacher said, well, you can't just help the bright ones, you've got to help the other ones too. So what I discovered was they all wanted to draw something realistic like a hand. So I took each one of the special ed kids to the Xerox machine and we Xeroxed their hand in whatever position they wanted. And then I discovered just with a number 2 pencil, you could erase in the bones, you could add the muscles, you could give them a format. In other words, this became, their own hand became a template for then we could do overlays with acetate of bones and muscles, and they could color them, whatever. So again, here we go with art saving saving lives and teaching kids many different things. So just a quick little kind of thing that was really very interesting that even kids on lower intellectual levels could catch on to, which was fun.
I have a question.
Yes,
Is
I'll pass this around.
well, is the plastic that's on the
This is an acetate cover, and it came clear, and we just let them sketch on the top of it, and then you can spray it so it won't smear.
You mean, but my question is the top layer, not the layer, is that layer what the student drew?
Yes,
So the drawing is actually the top layer?
yeah.
Oh, okay,
And they got the drawing, some of them traced over the original hand
I see.
print, some of them drew it more naturally, but it's kind of an interesting little piece.
Yes, it is.
I keep thinking I should write it up and put it in a magazine somewhere because it was a really great activity. So I want you to keep in mind, we use the left brain and we use the right brain. And we'll talk more about those in the next slide.
Oh, thank you.
And we use those elements of art and principles of design, especially when we're older and we're more educated, on how we deduce whether we like this piece of artwork, how we value it, how we judge it. So if the left brain controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side, both sides. So this is kind of just a review of the brain itself. And then I wanted to just throw this one in because I'm looking for examples. I kept thinking of Tom's MRIs. And this gentleman's name, Paul Jenkins, I think he died about 2 years ago, was a chemical engineer and got fascinated with color and how to use color. And he did canvases, some about the size of this room. And he would tell paint and move paint very interestingly. And this one, the print didn't come out, it's slightly blurry, but they're so engaging. If you see one in person, it's like they swallow you up. It's almost like a whale comes along, opens its mouth, and takes you on some kind of a journey somewhere, which is really exciting. So I kept looking at your MRIs and thinking, oh, look at these painters who are painting the inside of our brain and how they relate. And this is Frank Netter, who is a very well-known, he's also deceased at this point, but well-known medical illustrator. And you know, these, at the time this was done, is all pretty much done by hand. I brought 3 medical illustrations from the medical illustrator I worked with on the high school level. And these are done with airbrush, and you can tell this is the throat, and here's the mouth, and I've forgotten what this one is. Tom probably will know. Very proficient in skills with airbrushing. Lots of friscuits are used, which are like paper overlays with cutouts in them that you spray through to get the effects. Right now, I would say the medical illustration field is, a lot of it is done on the computer. So a lot of those hand skills I don't think are as recognizable as they were in the past. And a lot of the medical illustration is being done now for drug companies and commercials and magazines and things like this. However, in my career, I had 3 kids go off and become medical illustrators, which was really, really nice. And before I go on to that, we'll do one more of the Frank Netters. This was a detail.
Thank you.
Beautifully done, and you know, if you cover the eye and you look at this, you know, you've almost got a landscape. You've got an aerial view. You've got, you know, again, beautifully painted, beautifully done, and I'm sure probably anatomically more than correct.
Okay.
And just going back to that class I taught for medical illustration, these are some beginning drawings that kids did. And if I have met, I think in 42 years, one person I couldn't teach how to draw. It's in the mind. And if you can develop a trust, like he was saying, with a patient, and you can free them enough that they can trust you, you can teach them how to draw. It's a matter of making something look 3-dimensional on a 2-dimensional surface. We did medical illustration as a science, and then we did it as more of an illustration art form. So here's another more realistic one. Here's the fetal pig. And then the more abstractions, this is, Diane will appreciate this one. This one is the fetal pig in a tutu. So we said, you know, what would you do if you could draw your animal that we've dissected, and we worked with the science teacher in the room and the art teacher. You know, how would you change it? This kid was hilarious. He had such a genius in humor. And I keep thinking I'll frame this one because it was so charming. Yeah, these are all kids 9 through 12. This girl went on to become a medical illustrator. This girl ended up in Cornell Medical School. This one was called Metamorphosis. She changed a hand into a rose. I think they're such fun to share because they're so beautifully done. This girl became a graphic designer. She made a linoleum cut of a vertebrae and did some drawings of bones and muscles and put them on top. I mean, they do resemble some artworks you've probably seen. So artists get information from all kinds of sources. And certainly you can think of Da Vinci and you know he used the human form and the human body. So again, my feeling, going back to what Tom had said earlier, was I wish we did more of this not only in high schools, but in medical schools. I do know in New York, because I talked to the lady who's teaching the class for New York Medical School, she's taking medical students to the Frick and they're analyzing art. And they're learning, there were so many beautiful portraits at the Frick in New York, that they're analyzing the paintings many times, and they're saying, as diagnosticians, doctors need to look at paintings, what condition might this person have or not? And if the colorations are this, was this person anemic, was she whatever. So I don't know her whole bag of tricks, but I know it's a successful program. And I think a couple other medical schools have been doing some things like that, which are interesting. This is the left mode of the brain, and I put down the different characteristics, the verbal, the analytical, the symbolic, abstract. This is the more sequential side, in my mind. And the right mode is more the nonverbal. The parallels, I think, could also be made to, and I didn't put him in, Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences. How many people are aware of his research? I'll try and bring that into the next lecture, a little bit about Howard Gardner and how some of us create with dominance, like some people, 85% of the population are visual learners, but there are kinesthetic learners they found that learn. I have one daughter that's a musician that learned audibly when we were starting to teach her to read. She visually would flip through the pages and didn't care that much, and we knew she was bright, but we didn't know how to reach her, so I said to my wife, my father was a musician, I played 20 years of classical piano, there are a lot of musicians, let's try reading it to her. The minute we started reading to her, her eyes were glued, and then from then on, we read everything, and then we taught her to read out loud. And she quickly, learned how to read, but audibly more than visually. Once she heard it, she could repeat the story to you. So there are different, and then there are cross references between learning styles also. So when we're thinking about how we analyze art and how we use our brain, it's also influenced by that psychology of your emotion, how you perceive, how you look at things. For instance, they've painted lunch boxes in factories, and they found that if they paint them a light green or a white, the worker feels they're not so heavy at the end of the day if it's a toolbox or a lunch box. But if they have a black, they're like, dragging out, like, this is so heavy, this is so different. And I know myself, when I go to the closet in the morning and I go to pick something out, what do you generally pick? How do you pick what you're going to wear? Often I go for the comfortability, the softness or the texture of whatever it is. Colors that make you feel comfortable. I used to be able to go into the kindergarten class and I could tell you the personality of each kid by the colors of what they were wearing. And you knew the kid with the bright red shirt, half the time mom picked it out for him. It wasn't. And you could trail their color schemes all the way back to their living room. A couple times I got the living rooms right in the house they were living in. So there's a whole, we're not going into it, but there's a whole psychology to color. And you know that the marketing world is brilliant at color. You go into, say, the perfume department at Saks Fifth Avenue, and you see the most prominent color is red. And I think primarily because red upsets the rods and cones in our eye, and it causes you to look very carefully, and it draws your attention. That's why stop signs are red, and it grabs your attention along with the different forms that they've selected, some of which Freud would have a heyday with, to seduce you into buying whatever this product is. So if you can throw in the color angle, the psychology of color, how we use our brains, and our comfort levels with our brain, which brings me back to this book, Nicolaides, which one of the ways he teaches people how to draw is through blind contour. And that's an exercise I think we're going to try next week since Tom can't be here and we can do some hands-on thing. One of the things about blind contour is when you're doing blind contour, say I'm going to draw my hand and I'm right-handed. I might sit in my desk at an angle and I'm drawing with this hand, but I'm not looking at the paper. So what does your mind say to you if you're not looking at the paper and you're drawing your hand?
Oh my God.
Oh my God. I think 90% of people think, okay, if I goof up, it doesn't matter, because who can do this? This is too impossible, this is too crazy, it doesn't make any sense, blah, blah, blah. But what really happens is, and this is 99% of the time, if you're drawing blind contour, your hand, your first thought would be you slow down, you look very carefully, you observe very carefully what you're drawing, and whatever you record is actually what you're seeing. Now, if you switch hands and you go back to your normal looking at the paper, we tend to go back to our symbol system, and we tend to draw very quickly, and we may not draw the detail that's there and look as closely. So taking something out of context to a new level and using that right side of the brain is very, very helpful. So generally speaking, artists have found a balance between that left and the right brain, but if you practice it yourself, it's amazing. And then after you've done, say, 2 or 3 hours with a group of people doing this, you put up their drawings and they're all like amazed. All the left-handed drawings look so much better than the right-handed ones because they look so much more carefully, recorded so much more information.
I think I've had classes with Gary. I don't know if you've done it, but turning things upside down when you draw, it's the same concept.
Exactly.
You put it out of
Like
context.
there's
Then you focus on it.
right in the another great book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. She has people draw a portrait of Stravinsky that Picasso had done, and they turn it upside down. So you show the Stravinsky, I think it's right in here, maybe I can find it quickly. You show his drawing, and it's a beautiful contour drawing, and contour line is one continuous line. Not seeing it right offhand, and I know it's in here. Anyway, without looking at the portrait from the normal angle, frontal, and turning it upside down and redrawing it, it takes away the fear you have of, I know I can't draw this and I'll never make it look like it. And again, 90% of the people end up having the Stravinsky drawing pretty darn good. They can't believe actually they were able to do it. So I don't think we have used our skills and our minds the way we should in developing this kind of skill, intuitive skill that we have. And I think a lot of people particularly are uncomfortable when they go to a museum because, you know, everybody runs to the Impressionists. Everybody runs to the realism because they can understand it. And we're going to later analyze 3 portraits, and I'll tell you the artists who've done them. But I think the comfort level needs to be encouraged that whatever I feel, if I walk in and I see this painting, whatever you feel, generally, your first intuitive thought is the correct one. Now, you may not like it because if it's a Francis Bacon who paints roadkill, and he's a brilliant painter and his work is just a painter's painter. It's so beautifully painted, but the subject matter, I'm getting goosebumps, is a killer. You know, you have to not worry about seeing a cat that's been run over by a semi-truck, you know, and you're okay if you can deal with that. But this brings me to another book, which I want you to look up, called Synectics by Nicholas O'Rourke. And he has a way of processing art where he says, look at everything in abstract, and then you can bring it into the real world. And I'm going to do an activity that he uses that I think is brilliant to teach you how to interpret art, how to create art. So I'm going to give you all this paper at the end because I really didn't get it all done in time because I wanted to hear what Tom was saying in the first lecture so I could kind of tailor, our two different areas and bring them closer together. So we'll get better the second time we do this, so you're getting the first run. Drawing is considered right brain. I consider drawing to be the foundation of the arts, whether it be sculpture, painting, collage, whatever. I think drawing if you have a feel for drawing and you can train yourself and your eye to draw, it opens so many doors for you. I think drawing is complicated and very sensitive. Many artists will say to you, most drawings are in color that might, for normal people, look like they're just pencil. But the really sensitive person drawing with, say, pencil or pen and ink, you see nuances in the color. You can see, black is made of the three primaries. You can see maybe a little red, a little blue, different colors looking very sensitively at things. So I think, again, you want to look at, and many times the abstract artists can draw very realistically. For instance, you look at Picasso in the blue period, the rose periods, beautiful realism. I mean, beautifully done, but then he gets on his personal quest and he goes into more symbolism, he goes into more abstract form. And I like Picasso. I don't think everything he did was wonderful. He was brilliant at marketing his work. He used to control it so that only so many pieces could come out of his warehouses every year. He was one of the few artists who made money and did very well at it. However, if you saw in the late 80s his show of the women paintings at the Museum of Modern Art, I had to stop in the middle to recuperate. There was such anger coming through and such an intensity about women that appeared in that show of 3 floors of women. It was exhausting. It truly was. But I think he was a genius. He was incredibly talented. So I think artists themselves, even though many times we equate the act of creating to this right side of the brain, I think there are combinations of right and left brain, obviously, and they differ amongst all of the art people, just as like you might equate with musicians, with doctors, whatever. And then I had thought, from earliest times, we look at drawing and paint. These are from the caves in southern France, and look at the line and the gesture and the flow and the symbolism and the abstraction. So from earliest time, man has used all of these elements unwittingly, without art analysis, without art education, without so many different things. It's amazing. And next time I'm going to begin with some different things about the psychology of the experience of creating art. But I wanted to leave a little bit of time so that you could ask questions of Tom and I both, and that we could, kind of have a precursor for what we're going to do next week. So does anyone have any questions? Diane?
I noticed whenever I was in grade school that I was a lot different than my sister, who was very bright. She teaches doctors. I do more artwork and photography and things like that. So I had trouble reading, like a lot of students did as well. I couldn't read quickly. I felt not real bright, but I got to do all the bulletin boards in my Catholic school. So I was in high school, I was good in math in the concept area, but not good in arithmetic. So is there a personality that is typical that doesn't fit in the normal? Well, you have to consider I'm 70, so this was a long time ago in the educational situation, and I didn't fit into school very well. Terrible speller. I can't tell you. There's lots of little foibles.
So, yeah, there's the left-right brain stuff we'll probably get a little more into in the next 2 lectures a little bit, but there's a lot of interesting things just about girls versus boys here. Okay, so testosterone seems to inhibit left brain development in children in some ways. So this is an idea about, there's various experiments to show this, but this is an idea of why more boys are dyslexic. So there's certainly going to be a spectrum of how we are left-right brain, just like there's going to be other aspects of our personality. Are we more introvert? Are we more extrovert? And then one thing we'll also talk about is, and this comes up in psychology too, is there are basic personality types that have been described since the dawn of time, and we're going to mention this, as we get into the Jungian archetypes, is that they're so classic that they've been described since the dawn of time. And we talk about a balance being a good thing sometimes. The balance between the left and the right brain might be what we need to make this particular kind of art. But it's these imbalances that make us special, or pathological.
Crazy.
Or crazy. So, you may have someone who's extremely left-brained, who is, NASA's top guy, but he might not be able to hold a conversation with you. And we might say, well, he's got Asperger's because he can't communicate with people. He has no right brain. He can't recognize emotion. He can't read faces. And then you may have another person who's extremely right-brained and really has trouble getting into med school because they really wanted to get into med school and be a doctor, but they couldn't get through math, and it was really hard. But once they got there, they really connected with patients. And actually, the med schools are now understanding this, and the new exams for med school are bringing a lot of psychology in. Can you understand people? Demonstrate to us that you can understand this human situation in a paragraph. And make something of it, not just chemistry and math and biology. So, I think that's a long-winded way of saying, that made you special, and we have ideas about where this right-left brain function can take us. But in the end, I think what you're describing is too complicated for me to answer in any way other than some. I tell my med students, when you don't know the answer, make something up.
One thing I heard about the education system is they're beginning to look at the number of kids that they turn out as graduating from college and they're not getting jobs. And they're beginning to feel, and I thought this was really good, they're beginning to realize that a person that uses their intuition and kind of thinks beyond the box that's what they want to cultivate. So they're now making little snap-together robots they're doing with 3-year-olds. To kind of, they have, squelched the arts all along during my upbringing, but they're now saying this is valuable. These are the people that have earned multiple amounts of money in computer science because they had the innovative idea. And they're making money and being very successful. So we want to do this with our young children. We want them to work in this direction.
Well, I think this is what Gary's getting at. Is, how do you teach creativity, Gary?
Well, I think that it's the environment you create to allow people to be creative. I think that's critical. And I think a good teacher knows how to manipulate that environment and integrate everybody in it in a comfortable way. Obviously, your teacher, you're not developed here.
No.
So somehow you made it through that.
It was a hard grade school.
Yes, it's true. It can be difficult.
I think it's very difficult to have a formula. And I think this is
Exactly.
where education, to a large degree, has become. I mean, in this era, is that you want to turn out, schools have to be one. Or, and so the thing that goes is art because it requires, it seems to me, recognition of an individual, and the teacher doesn't have time, nor really, probably, the desire, unless they're missionaries. A really good teacher, in my opinion, is a missionary. because
I
you're
agree
not
with
the,
you.
I know, I mean, I don't know, but I can sense it.
You're absolutely right.
And, you didn't mention poetry, I'll mention poetry, but
Wow.
the same thing
Another art
as
form.
painting. If people don't wanna move into territory that they haven't been to before.
They're
They
uncomfortable.
don't wanna walk around
Right.
it unless somebody tells them in a critical piece. Criticism, literary criticism
Right.
is the most creative endeavor in a way,
Mhm.
because a lot of that is made up, and it makes people feel very safe. That this is the
Right.
way you can look at something, and that is helpful. But then you can put it in a drawer, and you don't have to experience it. I mean, and this is a
Right.
very big generalization, and I didn't mean to talk so much.
No, that's fine.
But, I mean, everything is connected, and I
Yes.
think it's too hard unless you go enter a Rudolf Steiner
Right.
situation where you're rhythmy
No.
and color and,
Right, where in those schools,
Yeah,
and in
and
many unusual schools, and in public education in New York, which I
It's too
spent the
hard.
majority of my career, there are multiple learning centers in each classroom now. I think critical is this class size. But I know there'll be a reading center, there'll be the computer center, there'll be a rug where kids can integrate and read a book together. So teachers are saying, and I know we did this in our art classrooms, okay, this kid's finished with this project early, so send him to the computer, he can work on that little program over here. There's free drawing paper over there, you write me a story to go with the picture, or the picture to go with where. So a really fine teacher knows their clientele and knows how to direct that child. But class size is critical, the environment is critical, you have to have the tools to work with, which are critical. You can only do so many things out of toilet paper rolls, I mean, you gotta have money and you gotta have supplies, it's terrible.
I'm going back, a little bit back to drawing. In museums, when you see a painting, you can get very, very close and see the drawing. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Many, many paintings. I mean, but you do have to get up,
Right,
right up, and see the drawing that came first.
see, I think we should be encouraging people to realize that that painting is not just that surface, there are layers underneath. And that, paintings evolve.
With any kind of paintings?
Yes, pretty much.
Even
Watercolors? Well, not abstract.
Well,
I mean, abstract.
watercolor is a little different because it's less forgiving. I think watercolor is the hardest color form to work in because you have to have such superb control. And then there's always the luck of the accident and those kind of things that help. But education has proven that the arts could be the link to the future. All the research in the arts through art and music, the most current, is saying how important they are to the academics. And in fact, I think the English AP last year had art questions on it, conceptual questions about the arts, which was one of the first times they've done that. And I'm thinking, hooray, finally someone's reading current literature and current research so that we are, becoming more important. I think for years, people thought, the arts are so frivolous. And as late as I left my last job in public education in 2004, and my superintendent had called me in and said, I understand you're sculpting soapstone and each kid has about 5 pounds to work with. And can we afford this? And at this point they were spending $26,000 per child K through 12 on Long Island in this district. And I said, yes, it's like a couple-week procedure and there's not enough 3D experience, tactile experience for kids to work in because it's messy and people don't like messes. People don't want little kids to finger paint because they have to clean it up. I had a principal say to me, my children came and they had paint on their clothes. And I said, that's why they have smocks. And you do get messy with paint and that's part of the process. So the superintendent says, oh, okay. And I said, well, you're telling me basically art is elitist. And he looks at me and I said, okay, now let's get down to brass tacks. How many kids are on the football team? And how much does it cost to dress each one? And you have the field to keep up and the chalk guy and the scoreboard. All right, Mr. Bates, you can have the money. Don't ask what the athletic budget is.
A comment about, you're talking about teachers need to be responsive to the student. different. It's not one formula. You have to see what's in the student.
Absolutely.
That's what you were saying about the doctors.
Yes.
It's the same idea. You always have to do it. Everything's context sensitive and it's not a formula. It's real easy to be formula because that's what you're paid for. And that's what we're talking about, being able to be more holistic, and that takes time and effort, and hopefully.
And it takes the right personality for the educator. I'm remembering, as Tom Senior, I had this student who used to stand like him. She was this brilliant girl. Her mother was a teacher, the father was a doctor, and she would come in the art room and she would do a little tiny thing and she'd say, "Mr. Bates, can I go to the supply room?" And I'd say, "Well, Holly, why do you need to go?" "I just feel better in the supply room." She's now a psychiatrist. She wrote me back years later and said, "You saved my life, Mr. Bates. I spent half my life in the supply room with the paint jars and this and that, and I thought and I worked and I thought, you know, I was at a time where I had the freedom and I had a supply room right next to the art room, which is not always the case. So I could offer that little nuance and say, calm down, go back there, take your drawing pad, and, you know, I'll check on you in 10 minutes, whatever." So I think it really depends a lot on the teacher.
And another comment on this other comment about seeing art. Since I started taking courses in Osher, the drawing, watercolor, whatever, now when I go to the museum, and I always appreciate art, but I get up close and you can see the strokes and you can see the process, and I learn from that, which otherwise I'd look at it and I sort of see it and don't understand it, but since I've now gone through some of that, I have another level of appreciation of what's going on there, and I actually maybe learn something from looking at it. And that's another reason to do it. You're really seeing other levels of things, and it's opening up your experience.
That experience, the drawing I wanted to bring in mind, that was a medical illustration I couldn't find, but the teacher at the time said to us, "We're not using pens, papers, go outside, find something to draw with." So I found a twig, and I sharpened that and used that, and then she threw me a cork and said, "All right, now you can draw with that." I'm like, oh my God. Well, the drawing turned out to be one of the best drawings I'd ever done. And I think the fact of taking something that you're just unfamiliar with, you take a risk with it that you might not have taken otherwise. And, you know, you could cut the cork, you could slice it, you could stamp it, you could, so, you know, providing, say, a doctor or, you know, providing different elements to work with and how they solve that issue is so interesting and can be so rewarding. Yes?
Are you involved in any way with the program that the Carnegie Art Museum has to improve the dementia and Alzheimer's patients by bringing them into the museum to go
No,
around and look at
that sounds like a wonderful
paintings and
idea.
discuss it? Are you involved in that?
No, I'm not. We moved here from New York 4 years ago. Our daughter went to CMU, and that's how we learned about CMU. And we're very, very happy about it. And then we moved here to be near our daughter and our grandchild and son-in-law.
You're talking about emotional responses, and in speaking about looking at paintings, you were going more towards the technique of it. And I wonder if we're going to touch upon, like you were talking about functional MRIs, how one responds. A person looks at a painting and can see the technique or is looking at it and feeling something. As a musician, people will come to me, well, I didn't love that piece, but of course I don't know anything about it. And I'm saying that's irrelevant. It's how it's reaching you emotionally.
Exactly.
And so the technique is something that is there to reach you emotionally.
I think you can appreciate the technique that people, you know, but many times it's like, one of the first kids I had that earned an art award in National Scholastic Art Awards was a special ed student who broke all the rules and did this wonderful line-up cut of a horse. And it was in Nebraska, my first job, first year teaching. And the kid was like blown away that she could win an award. And her whole psyche came up, and the kids appreciated her more with that recognition. So a musician, there can be an idiot savant, there can be, you know, the IQ plays a role to a certain degree, but then there's those natural born talents occasionally that break all the rules and are, you know, create something that's totally wonderful, which is inexplainable. But I think we can explain a lot.
I think we're with what these tools, I'm just giving you the basic neuroanatomy, it just gives you another way of looking at these questions, which we really can't answer, but it's another way of asking the questions of, you know, why, and what's different about, we're going to talk about what's similar about the way we react to things, and that's really what neurology is about, but what's really maybe more interesting is why it's different in some people. So, and you can look at it from a brain chemistry standpoint. Almost everybody in this room, if they took a particular drug, let's say, that increases your heart rate, or an amphetamine, would feel revved up, would feel energetic. Not everybody would, but some people would. If almost everybody in this room, if they saw a picture of a squashed cat, would have a certain response, maybe that's not a very nice response. But, and we'll look at this in functional MRI terms too. But we don't all react the same way. And why is that? And isn't that what makes us a little more special? There are these parts of our brain that do work differently. Right now, we're really looking at all the parts of the brain that work the same way, or that have a lot of similarities. But these unique differences in the way our brains work are probably the most interesting parts, and we can't answer those questions yet. But it's just another way of looking at these very difficult to answer questions about what makes us different.
But I do think we can give you some tools for, say, going to a museum and analyzing or looking at artwork, so you can feel more comfortable with what you're seeing and evaluating what you're seeing. And you can feel more comfortable how you're thinking about that. That's kind of our goal.
Yeah. Some people are just interested in how the brain works and how that dovetails in psychology. And so if you learn a few things here from these talks, it just might be something that you would want to go and study something more about. This is really just pretty basic, introductory.
Right.
Here's some things about the brain that we know now. If you're interested in these particular areas, you know, you can go study more, because there's certainly a lot of very detailed neuroscience out there now. And a lot of it is tied up with personality. And one of the biggest questions that I ask Gary this is because, where's the creative center of the brain? I don't know. I'm a neuroscientist, and I can't figure it out. I know my teacher, and I cannot figure out how to teach creativity, and I don't know what that part of the brain is. So that's just a toughie. Yeah.
I thought the left-hand, right-hand thing is sort of...
Yeah, we talk about the right being more creative.
Well, but I thought that it's not so isolated to sides, that it's much more mixed, and I thought maybe that's what you were alluding to with the fMRIs. That's really showing that there's really, it's a different shape, and things
It's
emerge.
way complicated, but the segmentations do work to some degree. For instance, most language is on the left side of the brain. For almost all of us, you have a stroke on the left side of the brain, there's going to be big language problems. Right side of the brain, not so. Even for the left-handers, 15% only are really going to have big speech problems with a stroke right there. Stroke right here, ooh, you're in trouble with your language. So a lot of it really is well localized and segmented, but these more complex things like art and creativity, even though we think about the spatial orientation being mostly right brain, which it seems to be, three-dimensional thinking, it's not so simple. It's very complicated. That's what we keep learning about science. It just gets more and more complicated.
It would be interesting to note, you were mentioning the personality profiles and how you can designate certain personalities, how those personalities relate to the arts, and if there are any proclivities that they have.
I'm going to leave that to you.
That might be pretty fascinating.
You didn't talk too much about the left brain. The only thing I have here is the verbal.
Well, I think it's the more sequential, more mathematical, more... have any of you taken the Myers-Briggs personality profile test?
Yes.
And I think that's a pretty darn good test. That relates a little bit to the subject matter too. Like, I took the test and came out to be abstract random, and my wife came out concrete abstract. And she thinks more mathematically, I don't. And I'm all over the place, and it typified in the house. I'll have 3 or 4 projects going, and they're all in flux. There's something going on this floor, that floor. I've got planning outside, I'm doing this. And she's saying, just finish one. finish that one over there. I don't care if that one's not. Just finish one. I can't stand. And it's not like I've got huge messes everywhere. But that's also the way I create, and like putting together what I was doing here. I was like pulling all these pieces together all over my studio, laying them all over, tripping over them, Joe came to bail me out with helping me with the PowerPoint, because I was spoiled in New York. I had someone who would do the PowerPoints for me. But anyway, we just perceive and we do things so differently. We did that Myers-Briggs in the school district I was in, and it improved communication so much between the administrators. It was such a help. Because I knew that the high school principal was this concrete guy, and I had to go in. I couldn't give him any abstract fluff. Nothing, it had to be all bare bones. This is 1, 2, 3. We couldn't do, when I take an exam, I look at the 10 questions, I go to 10 first. Who wants to do 1? 1 is boring. Why don't you do 10? And then how about 5? I couldn't, and I write on my paper, I'm all over the place. Too boring to stay on all the lines the straight way. It's much more fun to do an angle and do, my wife, it's all in a line. It's like, it's just, whatever works for you. It's not always the easiest to read, but it's however you process. Any other questions anyone have? I hope we're giving you some good, I know Tom's giving you the good ideas. Mine's a little, little all over the place.
Yours is the best.
I was trying to pull in all those things that my teaching has taught me, and I'm sure you can relate as a music teacher also. Even with voice, there's similarities to the teaching end. But I think we're a whole package holistically. So whenever Diane looks at a piece of artwork, she brings to the table her past experiences and everything that she is now. And so you're probably less intimidated than you were 20 years ago to say your opinion about some things, because as we get older and wiser, we may speak up a little more than we did earlier. But I think if we can give ourselves those tools and understand more, understanding is really critical. So,
I have a question from something that was said last week. You said that you could tell a male brain from a female brain, and you could tell, were you kidding, a liberal brain from a conservative brain?
The liberal brain from the conservative brain, I'm going to have to look up. It was on NPR. You could just you could Google that or get it on NPR. But the male-female brain experiments were actually done with functional MRI around the concept of anger. And when a man thinks of something that makes him angry, he has much more focal and localized portions of his brain light up, whereas when a female thinks about anger, something that makes her angry, there's a lot more parts of the brain that light up. So that's how that experiment went. I didn't read the particulars on it, but that was another functional MRI study. So take it as it will. I hope that didn't sound sexist.
Well, it's brainwashing. Something, like brainwashing.
Brainwashing.
And, in certain societies, probably, and you would know this, they could decide, okay, this is my ideal person that's going to help this society. And whether it be chemical, surgical, whatever ways that you could manipulate the brains of people and then have them all do.
So psychiatrists and neurologists are not in the business of trying to change personalities. We will tell people, if you've been depressed your whole life, that's your personality, and you like yourself enough, that's okay. If you're kind of a depressed person, we don't want to mess with that. If you're a sort of an anxious, high-powered person, but you function well with that, and you're not, it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me, it's your personality. It's okay to be a little anxious, but it's mainly when people say, this is not me. I've never been this depressed. Even though I've been depressed my whole life, I've never been this depressed, and I don't like it. And there's various reasons that occurs. A lot of times aging itself is a risk for depression. And so the idea is, or some people just as they mature, things trigger in the brain chemistry. And so the idea is to make people feel more like themselves. So we're not in the business of engineering personalities. As far as particular personalities and knowing what kind of brain chemistry they have going, probably the one that we know the most about would be the obsessive-compulsive personality. And so when that gets to an extreme where it really gets in the way of your life, and we kind of define that as not just I'm fastidious, I'm making sure I do things well, but you're wasting time doing the same thing over and over again with these checking behaviors. And you've probably seen a list of what makes the obsessive-compulsive. And that is very much about the serotonin system. And you manipulate the serotonin system, and you can help those people a lot to have better lives. But again, that would be the one exception of re-engineering a personality. and when somebody just says, I've always been this way and I've never liked it, please fix it. But most of the time it's because, and so we don't obviously want to brainwash people, that's a whole different thing.
Oh, I know you don't, but I'm thinking, I was just thinking diabolically.
Yeah, diabolically.
You know,
Could it be done?
societies, and
You
even
wonder
today,
about the cults.
probably.
Yeah, the psychology of cults, I don't know much about, but I would think that they are somehow manipulating the same parts of the brain that are involved in obsessive thinking, because you become obsessed with whatever your cult is.
I'm
It
sure
has
there are
something to do
movies.
with obsessions, maybe, I would guess, but that's a psychology area I don't know much about. And, yeah.
That's what Clockwork Orange
Yeah, so the clockwork
is about, the
yeah,
re-engineering.
yeah. Can you
Yeah.
re-engineer it?
And is it good
yeah,
or bad that
yeah, but that-
you've changed?
Yeah, the premise of that movie has never been worked out in actual human experiments. It's an interesting movie, but.
Oh, no, I don't think it is.
Whenever these MRIs
Huh.
are really cheap, you're gonna find out a lot about a lot of people.
Yeah, well, maybe more than we want to know.
Yeah.
Maybe more than we want to know, yeah, because you can, in fact,
You know, the study that you referenced a few minutes ago about the comparison between the male and the female
Yeah.
anger,
Yeah.
that would be the kind of thing that I would be really interested in learning more about, like actually hearing about the study and seeing the photographs
Yeah.
of the female and the male
yeah.
brains.
I'm going to show a few more functional MRIs in the lecture after the next one. We're going to have Gary's lecture, then we're going to have Thanksgiving break, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk some more about functional MRI, and I'll show you some of those. And then that's something you can actually Google. There's so much functional MRI out there that just, I got this stuff I haven't even heard about yet, but somebody told me, hey, did you hear on NPR today? Functional MRI, conservatives versus liberals. So yeah, it's really amazing how far it's gone. It just
Got it.
skyrocketed.